I'll be discussing 5 presidents whose accomplishments have been largely forgotten, or in some cases, overshadowed by their failures. However, many of their achievements are major ones, and these 5 men deserve to be rated more highly than they currently are. Number 5. Jimmy Carter, President of the United States of America, from 1977 to 1981. During his presidency, Jimmy Carter established the Department of Energy and Education, improved the environment with the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act and the Superfund Act. The Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act was signed into law in 1980. The act protects 104 million acres of federal land within the state, which are designated into national parks, wildlife refuges, and conservation areas. Established a national energy policy that contained new technology, conservation, and price control. In 1978 at Camp David, Carter successfully produced the first peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, which Carter himself negotiated between Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Carter must have liked defying the Washington establishment, but he himself said he had a higher purpose of bringing Egypt and Israel to the bargaining table.
I've been a Bible teacher since I was 18 years old. I taught Bible lessons at the Naval Academy Chapel when I was a midshipman at Annapolis. I knew the geography of the Holy Land. I knew the ancient histories and the challenges and so forth. So I had an idealistic ambition of seeing if I couldn't bring peace between Israel primarily and Egypt, and address simultaneously the problems of the Palestinians.
It took almost 2 weeks, but finally Carter got Sadat and Begin to agree for peace. The signing of the Camp David Accords was the high mark of the Carter years. A few months after the Accords, an energy and economic crisis that had been rising through the 1970s caused Carter's popularity to plummet.
Jimmy Carter deserved the blame for the stagnant economy? Of course not. But did he do anything to exude consumer confidence? No.
There was a perception that this was a good and decent man who was in over his head.
The summer of 1979 gave an image that would be familiar with the last years of the Carter administration. Americans waiting in line for gas. The problem was beginning to overheat.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
Carter's 1979 speech was supposed to be a national pep talk, but soon after, critics began calling it Carter's malaise speech.
Everything he was saying was very true, but American people don't want to be scolded, and if something's going wrong, they don't want to be told they're the cause of it. We hire a president to fix our problems, not to whine about them.
As if the gas and energy crisis wasn't enough on Carter's plate, he was about to face another crisis that would begin to take over the rest of his presidency. In the fall of 1979, Islamic militants stormed into the American embassy in Iran and took 52 Americans hostage. Amongst the other bad news, Carter was defeated for a second term in a landslide victory by former movie star Ronald Reagan. Carter became obsessed on working to free the hostages. During his last days in office, he spent hours on end seeking a negotiation. On the day of Reagan's swearing in, Carter was informed while listening to Reagan's speech that all 52 Americans had been freed and were on an airplane home.
They had been sitting in an airplane at the end of the Tehran airport for about 2 hours and a half before that time, just waiting, I think, according to the Ayatollah Khomeini, until I was no longer president.
In 1999, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, followed by the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his humanitarian efforts and peaceful solutions on combating world problems. And so, Carter is more remembered for his failure in handling the gas and energy crisis and the Iran hostage crisis, rather than for establishing 2 new departments in a presidential cabinet, forging a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, and his humanitarian work. Number 4. Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States of America from 1963 to 1969. Coming into office after President Kennedy's assassination, Johnson started to put new laws he wanted into effect. Johnson signed Medicare into law on July 30th, 1965. Former President Harry Truman was the first recipient. Growing up in the rural South, Johnson was often seen as a Washington outsider. His experiences with minorities and the poor was unique among presidents. The assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22, 1963, allowed Johnson enough political momentum to put civil rights front and center by signing the Civil Rights Act.
We believe that all men are entitled to the blessings of liberty. Yet millions are being deprived of those blessings. Not because of their own failures, but because of the color of their skin.
No president wanted to do more for African Americans than Lyndon Johnson. Civil rights was absolutely at the core of his commitment to a better America, to a great society.
LBJ's Great Society resulted in an explosion of new laws. The Voting Rights Act, Medicaid, federal aid for education, environmental protection laws, food stamps, Head Start, National Public Radio, the public broadcasting system, and consumer protection laws. Johnson also further expanded Kennedy's attempts to fight a war on poverty. He succeeded, cutting the number of people who lived in poverty by half. Winning the war in Vietnam was another matter. In the summer of 1965, General William Westmoreland told Johnson he risked losing the war unless he prepared the troops, added more firepower, and raised the number of troops in Vietnam from 65,000 to 125,000. Johnson approved 100,000 more to be sent, but America came no closer to winning the war.
How could it be, he kept asking, that these Vietnamese guerrillas, these guys running around the jungles in black pajamas, could stand up to American military power, to our superior firepower, our technology? This he couldn't fathom, couldn't quite square that with the reality.
By 1968, the anti-war movement had gained much momentum. What had begun as Truman's containment policy was now Lyndon Johnson's war.
I spoke to Mrs. Johnson about this, and she said he heard those protesters marching up and down in front of the White House, shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And it was a wound in his heart. He suffered terribly, she said, over the fact that so many boys were dying.
The enemy of freedom has chosen to make this year the decisive one.
The final year of Johnson's presidency began with the devastating Tet Offensive. The bold North Vietnamese attack on Saigon made victory seem impossible. To make matters worse, there were divisions in the Democratic Party. Under fire, Johnson decided not to seek re-election.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Lyndon Johnson, I think, is the most tragic of all of our American presidents, because no man fell from a higher pinnacle, and no man sought more not to be a war president.
At the end of his presidency, Johnson tried negotiating peace with Vietnam, but failed. In the end, Johnson is more remembered for his failure in the Vietnam War rather than putting a dent in poverty and ending segregation in America. Number 3. Harry Truman, President of the United States of America from 1945 to 1953. Truman succeeded to the presidency after the death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12, 1945. World War II ended shortly after, and he was elected to his own term in 1948. On April 3, 1948, Truman signed the Marshall Plan, a relief program that gave $12 billion in economic support to Western European countries to help rebuild after the war. Truman decided to tackle racism around this time as well.
He understood the hypocrisy between having just fought a war, ostensibly, against racism, and yet racism embedded in every aspect of American life.
There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, or religion, or race, or color.
In January 1948, Truman boldly ended segregation in the armed forces and the civil service by executive order. America loses their long wartime ally, China, to communism.
He had been talking about the need to contain communism. Containment had failed in China, and it was inevitable that he was going to have to accept the blame.
The Chinese Revolution, followed by the Soviets diving into atomic weaponry, caused hysteria throughout America. Truman's administration was attacked by Senator Joseph McCarthy for being soft on communism.
When, 6 months later, North Korean communists invade South Korea, Truman, from a political standpoint, had almost no alternative but to say that the United States was going to go to the defense of non-communist South Korea.
The Korean War was unlike any other. Despite some successes, it became a stalemate when China threw its large military behind North Korea. By the end of his second term, nothing seemed to be going right for Truman. He was tarnished by the ongoing fight in the Korean War, the loss of China to communism, and rumors of corruption throughout many sectors of the executive branch. Truman's popularity plummeted.
When Truman left office at the beginning of 1953, he himself probably thought that he couldn't have been elected dog catcher, even in his hometown of Independence.
As a result, Truman is remembered for the Korean War rather than helping America out of World War II and see victory, helping rebuild Western Europe, and taking the first steps to ending racial segregation in the United States. Number 2. Herbert Hoover, President of the United States of America from 1929 to 1933. Became known as the Great Humanitarian during World War I. After World War I broke out in 1914, Hoover helped plan the return of about 120,000 Americans trapped in Europe. Within a day, 500 volunteers had showed up with canteens of water, food, clothes, and steamboat tickets. Hoover helped starving children throughout Europe by organizing food drives and encouraging volunteerism. By the end of World War I in late 1918, Hoover had become known as the man who fed Europe. Hoover persuaded countrymen to Hooverize, sacrificing their own comforts so that Allied populations could survive. Hoover was food administrator under President Wilson, followed by Secretary of Commerce under Harding and Coolidge.
Many of the qualities that made him look that he would be so good for leading a period of prosperity were really not up to dealing with the challenges of the Depression.
Hoover became paralyzed by his lack of charisma. His bland and dull public speeches did little to spark positivity.
What our people need is the restoration of their normal jobs, the recovery of agricultural prices, and the business.
Hoover didn't think that the government should help fight off the Depression. Instead, he believed in volunteerism, which had worked so well for him back in World War I, asking companies to voluntarily improve working conditions and pay.
If I could have counseled Herbert Hoover in 1930 or 1931, I would have said, Mr. President, the government needs to do more. Volunteerism isn't going to work. Unfortunately, I think what happened to Hoover was that the Depression traumatized him.
He made his plight much worse by becoming extremely defensive. He just didn't have the temperament, among other things, to deal with a crisis of this magnitude.
On the eighth day of
Hoover decided to run again in 1932. Unfortunately for him, he had to run during the depths of the Depression. His opponent that year was the young, charismatic Democrat Franklin Roosevelt. The campaign made Herbert Hoover's name a permanent punchline.
A Hoover hotel was a cardboard shack. A Hooverville was a collection of cardboard shacks. A Hoover flag was an empty pocket turned inside out.
The summer of 1932 was agonizing for Hoover. He hit the campaign trail and tried to be optimistic.
Wherever he appeared, there were angry Americans with signs critical of him. There were people who shouted, "We want bread." And everywhere he went was the specter of hunger. It must have hurt him tremendously to campaign. What Roosevelt offered was a sense of hope that even if today I don't have enough to eat, or even if today I don't have a job, it will be better tomorrow. Whereas it seemed that during Hoover's administration, it just wasn't getting any better.
Some historians believe that looking at Herbert Hoover through the image of FDR is unfair.
Imagine if somebody like FDR had been in office in 1929. You know, somebody, a real public charmer, you know, glad-hander. By 1932, they would have been clamoring for somebody different, somebody who's not a politician, somebody who understands the economy, somebody like Herbert Hoover.
In the end, Hoover is best remembered for his inept handling of the Great Depression, rather than for his humanitarian efforts and achievements. Number 1. James K. Polk, President of the United States of America from 1845 to 1849. Polk set out to accomplish 4 goals in his 4 years as president. His goals were to gain the Oregon and California territories and put them into the Union, set up an independent treasury to fix the bank problem that had persisted since Jackson, and to lower taxes on imports coming into America. Polk is sometimes dubbed as America's hardest working president. He was the first president to have gas lighting installed in the White House.
Polk was a hands-on micromanager as president. For example, he was the first president to really get deeply into the budget. He was the first president to tell all the heads of all the departments, look, don't send your budget requests straight to Congress. Send them to me.
To accomplish his economic goals, Polk put pressure on Congress to lower the federal tax and establish an independent treasury. It was successful.
Polk represents the shift from the politics of economics, which was central to the Jacksonian period, to the politics of expansion.
More than anything else, Polk wanted to fulfill the promise of America's manifest destiny. Great Britain was the first to fall into Polk's sights.
In the Pacific Northwest, Britain and the United States had been sort of ruling this vast tract of fur trappers' land in tandem, and Polk is tired of that arrangement.
Polk demanded all of the Oregon Territory up to the latitude 5440. 5440 or fight became a popular campaign slogan, and the British gave up about 360,000 square miles of land to avoid war. Polk decided to turn his eyes south. Negotiations didn't go so well. Mexico refused Polk's $15 million offer to acquire New Mexico and California. So, he went to Plan B instead. War.
Bold leadership doesn't consist in backing down in the face of challenges. Bold leadership consists in confronting challenges, maybe even creating the challenges. And this was one that Polk brought on almost by himself.
He kept badgering Mexico, pressing Mexico to the wall, and finally Mexico reacted and shot some American soldiers, which Polk used as an excuse to get a declaration of war.
When the country goes to war, the American people have no choice but to rally behind the president. And victory absolves presidents of all sorts of questions about how the war started and what it was for.
The war is quickly won. We grab the vast chunk of the American Southwest, most of Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, all are taken by this war with relatively few military casualties.
By the time his 4 years in office were over, Polk had managed to add about 1.2 million square miles to the United States, about a third of the country's size today.
James K. Polk added more territory to the United States than any other president. For sheer accomplishment, it's hard to beat.
Just imagine if you're a president and in retirement you can, in effect, see your name on half of the North American continent.
Unlike the other presidents included in this presentation, Polk's accomplishments are not overshadowed by failure, but just got swallowed up by the national trauma that would come shortly after. The Civil War. Hopefully this convinced you how these 5 presidents should be considered at a much higher place in history than they currently are. Thanks for watching.